The autumn of 1946 arrived in the Cotswolds with the kind of golden light that made the English countryside particularly beautiful. Warm afternoons that stretched into cool evenings, harvest completed and fields lying fallow. Stone villages that had stood for centuries glowing honey-colored in the slanting sun. Near the market town of Cirencester, a small work camp housing approximately 40 German women prisoners had been established to provide agricultural labor for farms still struggling with wartime manpower shortages. These women were members of auxiliary military services captured during the war's final months: radio operators, administrative staff, nurses who had served with Wehrmacht medical units, women whose non-combat roles had nonetheless placed them in military structures when those structures collapsed under Allied advances. They had been processed through the standard prisoner of war system, photographed and documented, and assigned identification numbers, and now they worked on British farms during the day and returned to their barracks each evening, living in the peculiar limbo of people whose war had ended but whose freedom had not yet been restored. The camp itself was basic but adequate: converted farm buildings fitted with rows of bunks, a communal dining hall, washing facilities that provided hot water when the boiler functioned properly, perimeter fencing that marked boundaries without creating the oppressive atmosphere of maximum security detention. The British Guards were mostly older men unfit for combat service or younger soldiers awaiting demobilization, supplemented by women's auxiliary territorial service personnel who supervised the female prisoners during work assignments and managed daily camp administration. The commanding officer, a Captain David Richards who had spent the war years coordinating agricultural labor programs and understood more about farming than military operations, believed that productive work and fair treatment created fewer problems than harsh discipline and constant surveillance. His instructions to his staff were pragmatic: keep the prisoners busy, feed them adequately, maintain order through structure rather than punishment, and get them repatriated as soon as the bureaucratic machinery permitted. The German women worked primarily on farms within a 5-mile radius of the camp, assigned to tasks that British agricultural labor desperately needed: harvesting root vegetables, processing grain, maintaining livestock, the ordinary work that kept farms functioning through seasons that waited for no one. The farmers who employed them were mostly older men whose sons had served in the military or younger farmers exempted from service because food production was essential war work. These farmers had spent 6 years managing labor shortages, had employed Italian prisoners before German prisoners became available, had learned to assess workers by their competence rather than their nationality because harvest required completion, regardless of political allegiances. One particular farm where several German women worked regularly belonged to a family named Harrison, 3 generations farming the same land. Approximately 200 acres of mixed agriculture that produced grain and vegetables and maintained a small dairy herd. The family patriarch, Robert Harrison, was in his 70s, had lived through 2 world wars and remembered when German workers had come to England as seasonal laborers before the Great War made such exchanges impossible. His son Thomas managed the daily operations, working alongside the German prisoners with the practical acceptance that characterized farmers who measured people by their willingness to work, rather than by what uniform they had worn. On a particular October morning, 4 German women were transported to the Harrison farm for the day's work: potato harvesting, the backbreaking labor of digging and sorting and bagging tubers that would sustain British families through the coming winter. Among these 4 was a woman named Helga Weber, 28 years old, formerly a nurse with a Wehrmacht medical unit, captured near Hamburg during the final weeks of the war. She had studied English in school before Nazi educational policies made such study politically suspect, spoke the language adequately if not fluently, and had learned during her months in British captivity that communication with guards and farmers made daily life significantly easier than the hostile silence some prisoners maintained. The morning work proceeded in the usual pattern: digging potatoes from rows that stretched across fields, sorting them by size and quality, filling bags that would be transported to storage facilities, the repetitive physical labor that required stamina more than skill. The British Guard supervising the work detail, a corporal named Davies, who had worked as a gamekeeper before the war and understood outdoor work, maintained presence without constant interference, checking periodically that the women were working safely and efficiently, but otherwise allowing them to proceed at their own pace. Around mid-morning, Robert Harrison came out from the farmhouse carrying a basket containing tea and biscuits, the traditional British practice of providing refreshment to workers in the fields, a custom that predated the war and continued despite rationing that made such generosity costly. He approached the German women with the kind of matter-of-fact courtesy that characterized rural English culture, neither friendly nor hostile, simply treating workers as people entitled to reasonable consideration. He set the basket down, poured tea from a thermos into cups, offered biscuits that were plain but freshly made, and said in English that assumed the workers would understand, "Take a break, have some tea. Can't work all day without something warm in you." The German women accepted the tea gratefully, surprised by the gesture but wary of reading too much meaning into what might be simply practical consideration. Workers who were fed and rested worked more efficiently than workers who were exhausted and hungry. They drank the tea standing in the field, eating the biscuits, processing the small kindness that British farmers sometimes extended, even to enemy workers. And then Robert Harrison did something unexpected. He looked at Helga Weber, noted her nurse's bearing and the intelligence in her eyes that suggested education beyond basic schooling, and switched from English to German, not hesitant German, not the broken phrases of someone who had learned a few words for communicating with foreign workers, but fluent, grammatically correct, conversational German, with a slight Swabian accent that marked it as learned in southern Germany rather than from textbooks. Wie finden Sie die Arbeit hier? Ist es sehr unterschiedlich zu dem, was Sie gewohnt waren? How do you find the work here? Is it very different from what you were accustomed to? The silence that followed this question was absolute. The four German women stared at Robert Harrison, this elderly English farmer standing in his field in the Cotswolds, speaking German with a fluency that made no sense within their understanding of how the world worked. They had expected that British people might know a few German words learned during the war, that younger British soldiers might have picked up phrases from prisoners or during occupation duty. But an old English farmer speaking fluent German, speaking it naturally as though it were simply another language he used when circumstances required, contradicted every assumption about British insularity and cultural isolation that their education had instilled. Helga, recovering first from the shock, responded in German almost automatically. "The work is hard but fair. Different from nursing, but..." She paused, uncertain whether to continue, whether this was test or genuine conversation, whether speaking honestly to a British farmer in German was safe or dangerous. "Are you German? Were you born in Germany?" Robert Harrison laughed, the kind of comfortable chuckle that came from a man who had heard variations of this question many times. "No, I'm English, born in this village, never lived anywhere else. But I worked in Germany before the Great War, 1910 to 1914, working on farms in Baden-Württemberg, learning agricultural methods they used there. Spent 4 years living with German farm families, learned the language because that was how you functioned if you wanted to actually learn anything rather than just being foreign observer. Made good friends there, learned good farming techniques, came home in 1914 right before the war started and never went back." The explanation was delivered in German, the words flowing naturally, the syntax correct, the vocabulary precise. Harrison continued, switching to a topic that seemed safer than discussing wars and national allegiances. "Die Kartoffelernte hier ist anders als in Deutschland, nehme ich an? Die Böden hier sind schwerer, der Ton macht es schwieriger. The potato harvest here is different than in Germany, I assume. The soils here are heavier, the clay makes it more difficult." The conversation that followed, conducted entirely in German, observed by the British Guard who spoke no German and simply assumed the old farmer was making some effort to communicate with the workers, was unlike anything the German women had experienced during their months in British captivity. Robert Harrison asked about their backgrounds, about where they had served, about their experiences of the war's final chaos, about their families, and whether they had news from home. His questions were neither interrogation nor small talk, but genuine interest, the kind of conversation that farmers engaged in naturally because isolation made human interaction valuable when it occurred. The symbolic object that defined this moment was not physical but linguistic. The German language itself, spoken fluently by an elderly English farmer in the Cotswolds, bridging the divide between victor and defeated through shared communication that neither propaganda nor resentment had made impossible. Language was supposed to mark difference, to separate us from them, to maintain boundaries between nations and cultures. But Harrison speaking German demonstrated that language could also connect, could create common ground, could acknowledge shared humanity that transcended the temporary hostilities that war created. As the morning break ended and the women returned to work, Helga found herself processing what had just occurred. She had spent months in British captivity, assuming that British people knew nothing of Germany except what war had taught them. That Germans were enemies to be defeated, that German culture was Nazi ideology, that anything German was to be viewed with suspicion or hatred. But this farmer who spoke fluent German, who had lived in Germany and learned from German farmers and maintained respect for German agricultural methods, even after 2 wars had made Germany and Britain enemies, contradicted every simple narrative about national hostility and cultural isolation. The other German women, working alongside Helga through the afternoon, discussed the encounter in whispered German that the British Guard could not understand. "How is it possible?" one asked. "How does an English farmer speak German like he grew up there? Are we sure we're not somehow in the wrong country? Maybe the trucks brought us to Germany by mistake?" The suggestion was absurd. They knew perfectly well they were in England, had been processed through British prisoner systems, worked on British farms, but the cognitive dissonance was real. English farmers were not supposed to speak fluent German. British culture was supposed to be insular and monolingual. The world was supposed to divide neatly into us and them, with language marking the boundaries. But Robert Harrison speaking German had demonstrated that these assumptions were wrong, that some British people had crossed cultural boundaries before wars made such crossing suspicious, that learning another nation's language was possible without betraying one's own identity, that the divisions between peoples were more permeable than ideology suggested. When the workday ended and the women were transported back to camp, Helga told the story to the other prisoners, about the English farmer who spoke fluent German, who had lived in Germany before the Great War, who treated German workers with the same matter-of-fact courtesy he presumably extended to English workers. The story spread quickly through the camp's informal networks, gaining details as stories do, but always centered on the essential fact: an English farmer spoke German fluently, had learned it through living in Germany, maintained respect for German culture even after 2 wars had created enmity between the nations. The transformation this encounter worked on the German women was subtle but significant. They had been taught by Nazi propaganda that British culture was insular and declining, that British people lacked the cultural sophistication that made Germans superior, that language learning was something Germans did to dominate others while British people remained confined to their island, unable or unwilling to engage with other cultures. But Harrison speaking German, speaking it well, speaking it naturally, speaking it as a result of genuine interest in learning from German agricultural methods, contradicted these teachings comprehensively. If an English farmer had spent years in Germany learning language and methods, if he had made friends with German families and maintained respect for what he had learned even after 2 devastating wars, then perhaps Nazi claims about British cultural inferiority were simply wrong. Perhaps the relationship between Germany and Britain was more complex than propaganda had suggested. Perhaps ordinary people from different nations could connect across language barriers through shared interests and mutual respect, could maintain those connections even when governments made their nations enemies, could demonstrate through their lives that national hostility was not inevitable or permanent, but rather consequence of political decisions that individuals did not necessarily share. In the weeks that followed, Helga and the other women who worked regularly at the Harrison farm had additional conversations with Robert Harrison, conducted in German, that he spoke fluently and they spoke natively, about topics that range from agricultural techniques to family histories to the war's impact on both countries. Harrison made no speeches about reconciliation or friendship between nations. He simply talked with the German women as he would have talked with any workers, asking questions and sharing information, treating them as people rather than as symbols of enemy nation. Using German because it was language they shared, and communication was more efficient and pleasant when people could understand each other properly. His son Thomas, who spoke only English, watched these conversations with bemused tolerance. He had grown up hearing his father's stories about working in Germany before the Great War, had learned as a child that his father spoke German fluently, but had never quite understood why maintaining that ability mattered after 2 wars had made Germany Britain's enemy. But he observed that the German women worked more efficiently after his father talked with them, seemed less sullen and resentful, approached their daily labor with better spirit. The pragmatic farmer in him recognized that whatever his father was doing was producing good results, even if the larger significance escaped him. The other farmers who employed German prison labor heard about the Harrison farm where the old man spoke German to the workers, and some expressed concern. Was this appropriate? Should British farmers be communicating with enemy workers in enemy language? Did this represent disloyalty or dangerous sympathy with defeated foes? But most farmers, focused on practical matters of getting work completed, recognized that communication improved efficiency, that workers who could discuss tasks in their native language with someone who understood were more productive than workers struggling with language barriers, that Robert Harrison's German language ability was a resource to be utilized rather than problem to be suppressed. The British military authorities supervising the prisoner labor program heard reports about the farmer who spoke German, investigated sufficiently to confirm that Harrison's German language ability came from legitimate pre-war experience rather than from suspicious wartime contact, and decided that the situation required no intervention. The German women were working productively, no security concerns existed, and Harrison's conversations with prisoners stayed within appropriate bounds. If anything, the situation demonstrated that some British citizens had engaged with German culture before Nazi ideology poisoned that engagement, that connections between ordinary people from different nations had existed and could potentially exist again once the political hostilities ended. Robert Harrison died in 1952, having lived long enough to see the German women repatriated, to witness the beginning of European reconstruction, to observe the first tentative steps toward the reconciliation that would eventually produce the European community. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his agricultural innovations and his service to the farming community, noted his fluent German and his years working in Germany before the Great War, described him as a man who believed that learning from other cultures strengthened rather than weakened one's own identity. The German women who had worked on his farm and heard him speak German were by then scattered across Germany, most trying to rebuild lives in a divided nation. But some would remember the English farmer who had spoken their language fluently, who had treated them as people rather than as defeated enemies, who had demonstrated through his life that cultural boundaries were permeable and that respect for other nations could coexist with loyalty to one's own. The deeper significance of Harrison speaking German to German prisoners lay in what it revealed about the difference between ideological narratives and human reality. Nazi ideology had taught that nations existed in permanent hierarchies, that cultures competed for supremacy, that learning other languages was a tool of domination rather than means of connection. But Harrison's fluent German, learned through genuine interest in agricultural methods and maintained across decades and 2 wars, demonstrated that individuals could cross cultural boundaries without betraying national identity, that respect for other cultures enhanced rather than diminished one's own, that the divisions between peoples were consequences of political decisions rather than natural laws. The language itself, German spoken by an English farmer in an English field to German prisoners, became symbol of larger possibilities. In 1946, with memories of war still fresh and resentment still sharp, the idea that Germans and British might eventually reconcile seemed implausible to many. The hatred was too recent, the losses too great, the crimes too terrible. But Robert Harrison speaking German to German workers demonstrated that underneath the political hostilities were human connections that had existed before the wars and might exist again afterward. That language was tool of connection rather than weapon of division. That ordinary people from different nations could communicate across the chasms that ideology created if they possessed the skills and the willingness to bridge those gaps. For the German women working in British fields, hearing their language spoken fluently by their former enemy, the experience created cognitive dissonance that ideology could not resolve. They had been taught that British culture was insular and declining, that British people lacked interest in or capacity for engaging with other cultures, that German language and culture were superior to anything British civilization produced. But an English farmer who spoke German better than some Germans they knew, who had learned it through respectful engagement with German culture, who maintained that knowledge across decades of hostility, contradicted these teachings comprehensively. If they had been wrong about something as fundamental as whether British people could speak German, perhaps they had been wrong about many other things as well. About British character, about democratic societies, about the nature of strength and weakness, about whether Nazi Germany's defeat meant German culture's failure or simply German government's criminality. In the end, the story of the German women who asked, "Are we in the wrong country?" when an English farmer spoke fluent German captured something essential about the process of denazification that came not from official programs but from accumulated encounters that contradicted propaganda. Every time a German prisoner received unexpected kindness from British civilians, every time British treatment exceeded what Nazi ideology predicted, every time ordinary interactions demonstrated that the enemy was more complex and more human than propaganda allowed, the framework of lies that supported totalitarian thinking weakened slightly. And sometimes that weakening came simply from an old farmer speaking German in an English field, using language learned decades earlier to communicate with workers from a defeated nation, demonstrating through ordinary conversation that the barriers between peoples were constructed rather than natural, political rather than inevitable, and therefore subject to change when political circumstances permitted and when individuals chose connection over division.